The engine roared so loud it swallowed her breath, and then everything stopped at once, as if the sky itself had decided to watch what would happen next. Emily Carter's heels slipped against the smooth concrete of the private runway, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach as the wind from the Gulfstream G650 whipped her hair across her face, and for a single frozen second the world narrowed to noise, heat, and the terrifying realization of how close she stood to something she didn't control. But the real question wasn't why her husband brought her here, and it wasn't even why his voice had turned so cold over the past 3 months. It was why a jet worth $65 million suddenly went silent in the middle of takeoff procedures. Witnesses would later say there were at least 40 people on that runway. Ground crew, pilots, private security. And not one of them moved, not one of them spoke. Because something about the tension in the air felt wrong, like a storm that hadn't decided where to strike. Emily blinked hard, forcing herself to steady her footing, the polished white paint of the runway markings stretching out beneath her like a line she wasn't supposed to cross, while behind her, Ryan Whitmore adjusted his cufflinks with the same casual precision he used in boardrooms and interviews, as if this moment were just another transaction, another decision already made, just 6 months ago. He had held her hand in a Manhattan penthouse, promising her that this child would change everything, that they would finally slow down, that success meant nothing without family, and she had believed him because back then his voice still sounded like truth. But something shifted after the ultrasound, after the headlines, after the quiet introduction of a woman whose name Emily had only seen once in a message Ryan forgot to delete, and from that moment on the warmth in his eyes cooled into something distant. Something measured, something that calculated rather than cared. 2 days ago, Emily had made a call she never told him about, her voice low, her words careful, as if even the walls might betray her, and whoever answered had listened without interruption, without judgment, and ended the call with a single sentence that echoed in her mind now as the wind pressed against her back. "Just be there, I'll handle the rest." Now. Here she stood, on a private runway in Westchester County, less than 10 feet from a jet that shouldn't have meant anything to her, yet somehow felt like the center of everything, and as the engines powered down into an unnatural silence, a ripple moved through the crew, subtle but unmistakable, like a shift in gravity. Ryan took a step closer, his shadow stretching toward her across the concrete, his voice dropping just enough to avoid attention. "We're done pretending, Emily," he said, calm, controlled, final, and in that moment, with the wind dying and the noise fading, the runway no longer felt like a place of departure, it felt like a stage, and whatever was about to happen next had already been set in motion long before she arrived. Emily did not turn around right away, not because she did not hear him, but because something deeper than fear told her that if she moved too quickly, she would lose whatever fragile control she still had left, and control was the only thing standing between her and the version of this moment Ryan clearly expected. The silence around them pressed in tighter. No engine noise, no footsteps. Just the distant hum of wind rolling across the open tarmac like a warning that had arrived too late. "Pretending?" she repeated softly, her voice steadier than she felt, buying time more than asking a question, because questions forced him to speak, and every second he spoke was a second she remained standing. Ryan let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like amusement, as if the outcome had already been decided somewhere far beyond this runway. "You knew this was not going to last," he said, each word measured, rehearsed, like a line delivered too many times in his own head. "You just chose not to accept it." Emily finally turned, slowly, deliberately, her eyes meeting his, searching for something familiar, something human, but finding only calculation, the same cold precision that had built his fortune now directed at dismantling her life. For a moment, she remembered the man who once waited outside her office in the rain just to walk her home, the man who used to laugh too loud at his own jokes and hold her hand like it mattered. But that memory felt distant now, like something she had watched happen to someone else. "You brought me here to say that?" she asked, her gaze flicking briefly toward the jet behind him, its sleek white body reflecting the gray sky above, too pristine, too still, like it was waiting for a signal no one else could hear. Ryan followed her glance for half a second before returning his attention to her, and in that fraction of time, something shifted in his expression, not uncertainty, not fear, but impatience. As if the timing of events was not aligning with his expectations. "I brought you here because it is private," he replied, his tone sharpening just enough to reveal the strain beneath it. "No interruptions, no scenes, just clarity." Clarity, the word echoed in her mind like an echo that did not belong, because nothing about this felt clear, not the silence, not the jet, not the way several ground crew members stood just far enough away to pretend they were not watching. Emily took a slow breath, her hand still resting protectively against her stomach, feeling a subtle movement that grounded her more than anything else could, and that was when she realized something Ryan had not considered, something he could not control, the fact that she was no longer alone in this equation. 2 days ago, when she made that call, she had not known exactly what would happen, only that she could not continue pretending either, and now, standing here, with the air growing heavier by the second, she began to understand that this moment was not unfolding the way Ryan had planned. A faint sound broke through the silence, not loud, not dramatic, just the soft mechanical click of something disengaging from inside the jet, subtle enough that most people would have missed it, but not Emily, because she had been waiting for something, anything, that did not belong to Ryan's script. His eyes flickered toward the aircraft again, this time longer, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. And for the first time since they stepped onto the runway, the balance between them shifted, not visibly, not completely, but enough for Emily to feel it, like the ground beneath her had stopped tilting and begun to level out. "What is that?" Ryan muttered under his breath, more to himself than to her, and Emily did not answer, because she already knew something he did not, that whatever was about to step out of that jet was not part of his plan, and for the first time in months, the outcome was no longer his to decide. The door of the jet opened with a slow, deliberate hiss, not dramatic, not loud, but precise, the kind of sound that carried authority without needing to announce it, and every pair of eyes on that runway shifted toward it at once as if pulled by something invisible. A set of polished black shoes appeared first on the top step, unmoving for a fraction of a second, as though the person inside was taking in the entire scene before deciding to step forward. And then he did, one measured step at a time, descending into the quiet like someone who had never once rushed for anyone in his life. Ryan straightened instinctively, his posture tightening, his expression recalibrating in real time as recognition flickered across his face but failed to fully form, because what he was seeing did not fit into the version of events he had constructed. Emily did not move, did not speak. Her eyes fixed on the man stepping down from the aircraft. And for the first time since she arrived, her breathing slowed, not because the situation was resolved, but because it was finally shifting. Charles Carter adjusted the cuff of his navy overcoat as he reached the ground, his gaze sweeping once across the runway, taking in the distance, the personnel, the positioning, and then settling exactly where it needed to be, on Ryan, not with anger, not with surprise, but with a calm that felt far more dangerous than either. The ground crew exchanged quick glances, subtle but telling, because even those who did not know his name recognized the kind of presence that did not belong to ordinary men, the kind that turned private spaces into controlled environments with nothing more than a look. Ryan cleared his throat, the sound small against the weight of the moment. "Mr. Carter," he said, forcing a polite tone that sat awkwardly over the tension in his voice. "I was not aware this aircraft was in use today." Charles stopped a few feet away, leaving just enough distance to make the space between them feel intentional, calculated. "That is because it was not scheduled for you," he replied evenly, his voice low, steady, the kind that did not need to rise to be heard. The words landed without force, but their meaning settled heavily, like a door quietly closing. Emily felt the shift fully now, not just in the air, but in Ryan himself, the subtle way his shoulders squared, the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes moved more carefully, as if recalculating every next step. "We were just finishing a conversation," Ryan continued, trying to regain control, to frame the moment before it framed him, but the words lacked the certainty they carried just minutes ago. Charles glanced briefly at Emily, and in that brief look there was something unspoken, something steady, something that said more than any reassurance ever could, and then his attention returned to Ryan. "I imagine you were," he said, not asking, not accusing, simply stating, and somehow that made it heavier. A faint breeze moved across the runway again, lifting the edge of Emily's coat, brushing against her face, and for the first time since the engines had gone silent, the stillness no longer felt threatening, it felt controlled, directed, as if the entire environment had been reset by a presence Ryan could not override. Somewhere behind them, a security vehicle slowed to a stop, its engine idling quietly, unnoticed by most but not by Charles, whose awareness seemed to extend beyond what anyone else could see, and that was when Ryan realized something he had not considered until this exact second. That this moment was no longer private, no longer contained, and more importantly, no longer his. Emily shifted her weight slightly, her hand still resting where it had been from the beginning, but her posture different now, no longer bracing, no longer uncertain, because whatever came next, she was no longer standing here alone, and Ryan could feel it just as clearly as she could, even if he had no idea how completely the ground had already shifted beneath him. Ryan forced a small smile that did not reach his eyes, the kind of expression practiced in boardrooms and press interviews, but here, under the stillness of the runway, it felt thinner, less convincing, like a script that no longer matched the scene. "I think there has been a misunderstanding," he said carefully, each word chosen with the precision of a man used to controlling outcomes. "Emily and I were just discussing a personal matter." And the way he emphasized personal sounded less like a boundary and more like a request for control to return. Charles did not respond immediately, and that pause stretched just long enough to make the silence louder than any argument, his gaze steady, unblinking, as if he were allowing Ryan the space to hear his own words and recognize how little weight they carried now. Emily watched the exchange without speaking, her heartbeats slowing into something more deliberate, more grounded. Because this was the moment she had been holding on to, the moment where truth no longer needed to fight to be heard, it only needed to stand still and exist. A faint metallic click echoed again from the jet behind them, followed by the soft movement of another figure inside the cabin, someone unseen but clearly present, reinforcing what was already becoming undeniable, that this was not a coincidence, not an interruption, but something planned with a level of precision Ryan had not anticipated. "Personal matters are rarely conducted on secured runways," Charles said finally, his voice even, almost conversational, yet each word landed with quiet authority, not challenging, not raising tension, but redefining the space entirely, turning what Ryan had called private into something observed, something accountable. Ryan's jaw tightened, just slightly, but enough for Emily to notice, enough to reveal that the balance he relied on was slipping, not dramatically, not yet, but steadily. Like sand shifting under a structure built too close to the edge. "With respect," Ryan replied, his tone sharpening despite his effort to contain it. "This does not involve you." And for a moment, the air seemed to hold its breath again, not because of what he said, but because of what he did not understand. That involvement was no longer his to define. Charles glanced toward Emily once more, and this time his look lingered a fraction longer, not asking permission, not seeking confirmation, but acknowledging her presence as central, not secondary, and then he turned back. "It involves my daughter," he said, simple, direct, leaving no room for interpretation, and in that sentence, the entire dynamic shifted fully into place. Ryan's expression changed, not completely, but enough, the confidence in his posture adjusting into something more rigid, more cautious, as if he had just stepped into a negotiation where he did not know all the terms, and for the first time, uncertainty began to show, not in his words, but in the space between them. Emily felt it clearly now, the invisible line that had separated her from control dissolving, replaced by something steadier, something she had not felt in months, the sense that the narrative she had been forced into was no longer the only one being written. Behind them, one of the ground crew members subtly stepped back, creating more distance, as if instinctively recognizing that this was no longer a routine moment, but something that would be remembered, something that would carry consequences. Beyond the runway, Ryan exhaled slowly, his eyes shifting briefly toward the jet again, then back to Charles, recalculating, always recalculating, but this time without certainty. "I think we can resolve this quickly," he said, though his voice no longer held the same control it did before, and Emily understood then, not through words but through the quiet unraveling of his composure, that whatever he had planned for today had already begun to fall apart the moment the engines went silent, and nothing he said now would bring that control back. The air shifted again, not with noise this time, but with presence, the kind that made even experienced men reconsider their next sentence before speaking, and Ryan felt it before he fully understood it, the quiet realization that he was no longer directing the outcome but reacting to it. Charles took a slow step forward, not closing the distance completely. Just enough to redraw the invisible boundary that had once belonged to Ryan, and that single step carried more authority than any raised voice ever could. "You said you wanted to resolve this quickly," Charles said, his tone unchanged, almost calm, but there was something beneath it now, something deliberate, something that suggested this moment had already been anticipated long before Ryan arranged this meeting. "So let us not waste time pretending this is still your conversation." Ryan's composure tightened, not breaking, not yet, but adjusting in real time like a man recalculating numbers that no longer added up. "With all due respect," he replied, his voice controlled but firmer now, "this is a private matter between my wife and me." And for the first time, the word wife sounded less like a bond and more like a claim he was trying to hold on to. Emily felt that word differently, not as ownership, not as identity, but as something already slipping away, something that had lost its meaning long before they stepped onto this runway, and she did not interrupt, did not correct him, because she understood now that silence, at the right moment, could carry more weight than any argument. Charles's gaze did not move from Ryan, but his next words were directed towards something larger than just the two of them. "Private matters do not involve controlled environments, coordinated timing, and personnel placed at a distance," he said, each phrase landing with quiet precision, and as he spoke, Ryan's eyes flickered again, this time not toward the jet, but toward the edges of the runway where two additional vehicles had arrived without drawing attention, their presence subtle but undeniable. That was when it became clear, not just to Emily, but to everyone watching, that this was never an interruption, it was a response. A faint sound of a camera shutter clicked somewhere in the distance, barely audible, but enough to signal that this moment was no longer contained, no longer invisible, and Ryan heard it too, his head turning slightly before he caught himself, before he forced his attention back to Charles. But the damage was already done, the awareness had entered the space. "You are overcomplicating this," Ryan said, though his voice lacked the certainty it carried earlier. "I brought my wife here to talk, nothing more." And the simplicity of that statement felt almost fragile against the structure forming around him. Charles let a brief silence follow, not long, not dramatic, just enough to let the weight of the moment settle fully. "Then you chose the wrong place," he replied, and this time, there was no softness in the words, no room for interpretation, just a quiet finality that closed something Ryan could not reopen. Emily exhaled slowly, the tension she had carried since stepping onto the runway easing just enough for her to feel the ground beneath her again, steady, solid, no longer shifting under uncertainty, and she realized something important. In that instant, something that changed everything, that this was not about confrontation, not about argument, but about exposure, about truth stepping into a space that had been carefully constructed to hide it. Ryan's posture changed again, subtle but unmistakable, his shoulders tightening, his stance narrowing, as if the space around him had become smaller, more defined, more restrictive, and for the first time. He did not speak immediately, he hesitated, and in that hesitation, Emily saw what she had not seen in months, not power, not control, but doubt. The runway remained quiet, the jet still, the sky heavy above them, but everything had shifted, every detail, every position, every assumption, and as Emily stood there between the man she once trusted and the man who had just arrived, she understood with complete clarity that whatever Ryan had planned for this moment had already unraveled, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, and there was nothing he could do to put it back together. The silence did not break all at once, it fractured slowly, like glass under pressure, beginning with a single movement that seemed insignificant until everyone noticed it at the same time. One of the security vehicles at the edge of the runway repositioned by a few feet, its engine still low, controlled, but its direction now unmistakably aligned with Ryan rather than the aircraft. And that subtle shift carried a message no one needed to explain. Ryan followed the movement with his eyes before he could stop himself, and in that brief lapse, the version of control he had been holding on to slipped just a little further, because control depended on predictability, and nothing about this moment was predictable anymore. "You are making this into something it is not," he said, his voice firmer now, almost defensive, as if stating it could still make it true, but even as he spoke, his attention divided between Charles, the jet, and the growing awareness that this space was no longer neutral ground. Charles did not respond immediately. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his coat with a calm, unhurried motion that drew more attention than any sudden action could have, and when his hand emerged, it held nothing dramatic, just a slim leather folder, the kind used in boardrooms and negotiations, ordinary in appearance, but in this moment, it carried the weight of something already decided. Emily's eyes followed the folder instinctively, her breath steady, her posture unchanged, because she recognized what Ryan was only beginning to understand, that this was no longer about words, it was about records, timelines, evidence, the kind of things that did not shift with emotion or persuasion. Charles opened the folder without looking down, his gaze still fixed on Ryan, as if the contents did not need to be checked because they had been prepared with absolute certainty. "You are correct about one thing," he said evenly. "This is no longer complicated." And with that, he extended a single document forward, not forcing it into Ryan's hand, not closing the distance, simply placing it within reach, leaving the decision to take it as the first test Ryan would have to pass. Ryan hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but in moments like this, hesitation spoke louder than action, and when he finally reached out and took the document, the movement felt slower than it should have, heavier, as if the weight of it had already transferred before he even read a single word. The paper was crisp, precise, filled with language that carried legal clarity rather than emotional argument, and as his eyes moved across the lines, something changed, not visibly at first, but in the stillness of his posture. In the way his shoulders no longer held the same alignment, in the subtle tightening of his grip. Emily watched him carefully, not searching for reaction, but recognizing the moment when realization began, the moment when a narrative built on assumption collided with something undeniable. "This is not possible," Ryan said quietly, almost to himself, the confidence in his voice thinning into something uncertain, something unfamiliar, and Charles did not interrupt, did not correct him, because the document was doing that work already. A second camera click echoed from somewhere beyond the runway, followed by another, and another, not loud, not chaotic, but consistent, like a record being kept in real time, and that was when Ryan understood something he had not accounted for at all, that this moment was not just being witnessed, it was being preserved. Emily shifted her gaze briefly toward the horizon, the wide open sky that had felt so overwhelming just minutes ago now seeming distant, almost irrelevant. Because everything that mattered was happening right here, contained, precise, controlled, and for the first time since this began, she felt something settle inside her, not relief, not victory, but clarity, the kind that came when the truth no longer needed to fight to be seen, it only needed to be revealed. The silence did not last long because power has a way of announcing itself without raising its voice, and the moment the cockpit door opened, every head on that runway turned in the same direction as if pulled by an invisible thread. The pilot stepped down first, calm, composed, his uniform crisp in a way that spoke of discipline rather than display. But it was the man who followed that changed the temperature of the entire scene without saying a single word. Jonathan Hayes did not rush, he did not look around. He simply walked forward with the steady confidence of someone who owned not just the aircraft but the consequences unfolding around it, and even before anyone whispered his name, the ground crew straightened. The security team adjusted their posture, and Ryan Whitmore for the first time since arriving seemed to lose control of the rhythm he had been so carefully maintaining. Emily felt it before she fully understood it, a shift in the air, like pressure dropping before a storm breaks, and her fingers tightened slightly against the fabric over her stomach as she watched her father approach, each step measured. Each second stretching longer than it should. 2 weeks ago, when she made that call, she had not asked for rescue, she had not explained everything, she had only said 3 words that carried more weight than anything else she could have offered. "I am ready now." And Jonathan Hayes had answered with silence, not because he did not care, but because he understood exactly what those words meant. He had built his empire on timing, on knowing when to wait, and when to act, and now as he crossed the runway, the timing was no longer Ryan's to control. "You shut down my jet," Ryan said, his voice sharper than before, the calm veneer cracking just enough to reveal something underneath it, something uncertain, something calculating, because men like him did not fear confrontation, but they feared losing advantage, and right now the advantage was slipping through his fingers in front of witnesses he could not dismiss. Jonathan stopped 3 feet away, close enough that the distance felt intentional. Like a line drawn on the ground that no one dared cross, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, even, carrying farther than it should without ever rising. "No," he said. "I delayed your departure." And the distinction landed heavier than any accusation. Around them, phones were no longer discreet, several people openly recording now, the quiet understanding spreading that whatever was happening was not just a private disagreement but something larger, something that would not stay contained within the gates of a private airfield. Emily exhaled slowly, not in relief but in recognition, because this was the moment everything shifted from hidden to visible, from controlled to exposed, and she realized that the man she had married had underestimated one thing he could not quantify or manipulate. He had assumed that silence meant weakness, that patience meant surrender, and that the woman standing in front of him would never step out of the role he had written for her. Jonathan's gaze moved briefly to Emily, not asking, not questioning, just confirming, and in that silent exchange something passed between them that no one else could read, a lifetime of trust condensed into a single glance, before his attention returned to Ryan, whose jaw tightened as the realization settled in that whatever conversation he thought he was about to finish on his terms had already been rewritten, and somewhere in the background, as the last echo of the engines faded completely, the runway no longer felt like a place where people left, it felt like a place where truth arrived whether anyone was ready for it or not. Ryan's eyes did not leave Jonathan, but something behind them shifted, the calculation running faster now, adjusting variables that no longer behaved the way he expected, because this was no longer a controlled conversation, it was a situation unfolding beyond his reach, and for a man who built his identity on control, that was the first real fracture. "You delayed it," Ryan repeated, slower this time, as if testing the words, trying to reframe them into something manageable. "You do not have authority over my schedule." And the statement sounded strong on the surface, but underneath it carried a question he could not fully hide. Jonathan's expression did not change, not even slightly, and that absence of reaction carried more weight than anger ever could. "Schedules are flexible," he replied, his tone calm, measured, "especially when safety is involved." And the word safety settled into the air with quiet precision, shifting the context of everything that had just happened without needing further explanation. Emily felt that word land differently, not as an excuse, not as a justification, but as a line being drawn, a boundary that could not be argued away, and she realized that this moment was no longer about what Ryan intended, it was about what could now be proven, what could be seen, what could no longer be dismissed as private or misunderstood. A third vehicle rolled to a stop at the edge of the runway, this one more official in appearance, its presence subtle but unmistakable, and even before anyone stepped out, the implication was clear. This was no longer contained within personal boundaries, it had moved into something structured, something documented. Ryan's gaze flickered toward it, just briefly, but enough to confirm that he saw it, that he understood what it meant, and when his attention returned to Jonathan, the confidence that once defined his posture had narrowed into something more rigid, more guarded. "This is unnecessary," Ryan said, his voice tightening despite his effort to remain composed. "Whatever you think is happening here, you are escalating it beyond reason." And for a moment, The word reason hung in the air like something he was trying to reclaim, a framework where he still held influence. Jonathan took a single step closer, not aggressive, not confrontational, but deliberate, enough to shift the balance of space once more. "What is happening here is already defined," he said, and this time there was no softness left in his tone, no room for interpretation, just clarity delivered without emotion. "The only thing changing is who controls the outcome." And that sentence did not need to be repeated, because everyone present understood exactly what it meant. Emily's breathing remained steady, her posture aligned, no longer bracing, no longer uncertain, because the invisible weight she had carried into this moment was no longer hers alone. It had been redistributed, exposed, placed into the open where it could not be ignored. Behind them, the faint sound of footsteps approached from the newly arrived vehicle, measured, professional, and Ryan heard them before he saw them. His shoulders tightening again, his stance adjusting, not outwardly defensive, but no longer relaxed, no longer in command. "You are making assumptions," Ryan said, though his voice no longer carried the same conviction. "And assumptions can be dangerous." But even as he spoke, the certainty behind his words continued to erode, because assumptions required ambiguity, and ambiguity was disappearing with every second. Jonathan's gaze remained steady, unwavering. "So is certainty without accountability," he replied, and that was the moment the final shift occurred, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute, because in that exchange, the narrative Ryan had been holding on to no longer had space to exist. Emily glanced briefly toward the approaching figures, then back to Ryan, and for the first time, she did not see the man who had controlled every room he entered. She saw someone standing at the edge of something he could not step back from, something already in motion, something that had been set into place long before he realized he was part of it. And as the distance between intention and consequence closed, the runway felt smaller, tighter, as if every path forward now led in only one direction, and none of them belonged to him anymore. The footsteps grew louder, steady and unhurried, the kind that did not seek attention yet commanded it, and when the two officials stepped fully onto the runway, their presence completed what had already begun, transforming the moment from confrontation into consequence. Ryan turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge them without fully facing them, as if refusing to give the situation more control than it already had. But even that small movement revealed something he could no longer hide. The awareness that this was no longer a negotiation he could steer. "Is there a problem here?" one of the officials asked, his tone neutral, professional, but beneath that neutrality was structure, protocol, something far less flexible than any conversation Ryan was used to dominating, and for a brief second, no one answered, because the answer was already visible in the positioning, in the silence, in the way every person present had stopped pretending this was private. Jonathan did not step back, did not step forward. He simply remained where he was, centered, composed, allowing the moment to unfold without interference. Because this was no longer about asserting power, it was about letting reality speak for itself. Ryan inhaled slowly, his posture tightening again as he shifted back into the role he knew best, controlled, articulate, confident. "There is no problem," he said, his voice measured, carefully calibrated. "This is a misunderstanding being resolved." And for a moment, the words sounded almost convincing, almost enough to hold the narrative together if no one looked too closely. Emily watched him speak, and for the first time, she saw the effort behind it, the strain of maintaining control in a situation that no longer responded to it, and that realization changed something inside her, not dramatically, not emotionally, but clearly, like a final piece falling into place. The official's gaze moved briefly from Ryan to Emily, then to Jonathan, assessing, processing, and then back again. "We received a report regarding a safety concern on this runway," he said, and the phrasing was careful, deliberate, leaving space for facts to define themselves, and as those words settled, the structure around Ryan tightened further, not visibly, but undeniably. "There is no safety issue," Ryan replied quickly, just a fraction too fast, and that fraction was enough, because timing in moments like this revealed more than content ever could. Jonathan's eyes did not leave Ryan, but his next words were directed toward the officials. "There was a concern," he said calmly. And it has been documented. And that single word documented carried more weight than any accusation, because documentation did not argue, it did not exaggerate, it simply existed. Emily felt the shift again. Deeper this time, the realization that this was no longer about proving anything, it was about revealing what had already been captured, preserved, undeniable. One of the officials nodded slightly, not confirming, not denying, just acknowledging that the situation had moved beyond verbal explanation, and as he stepped closer, the space around Ryan narrowed once more, not physically, but procedurally. The kind of narrowing that did not rely on force, only on process. Ryan's eyes flickered again. This time not toward the jet, not toward Emily, but toward the edges of the scene, as if searching for something that no longer existed, an exit, an angle, a version of control he could still reclaim. But there was none, not here, not now. We will need to ask a few questions. The official continued, his tone unchanged, steady, inevitable, and in that moment, the last illusion of control slipped quietly out of Ryan's grasp, not with resistance, not with noise, but with the simple realization that this conversation was no longer his to lead. Emily stood still, her breathing even, her posture calm, and as she watched the man who once controlled every aspect of her life adjust to a situation he could not command, she understood something with complete clarity. That power built on control could disappear in a moment, but truth, once revealed, did not need to fight to remain standing. The questions began simply, almost quietly, but each one carried a structure that could not be avoided, not redirected, not reshaped by confidence or authority, and Ryan answered them the way he had answered everything his entire career, with precision, with control, with carefully measured words designed to guide perception rather than reveal truth. But this time the rhythm did not hold. "What brought you here today?" one official asked, his tone steady, his eyes attentive without being intrusive, and Ryan responded without hesitation, outlining a private meeting, a personal discussion, a planned departure, each detail arranged in a way that sounded complete, logical, contained. But as he spoke, something subtle began to fracture, not in what he said, but in how it aligned with everything else already present. Emily listened without interrupting, her gaze steady, because she understood now that this was not her moment to speak, not yet. This was the moment where narratives revealed their limits, where controlled versions of events met the weight of documented reality. "And the aircraft?" the official continued, glancing briefly toward the jet, its engines silent, its presence still commanding the space around it. "Was it scheduled for immediate departure?" And Ryan paused, just briefly, but long enough to register, long enough to show that the question had landed somewhere he did not fully control. "Yes," he answered. "It was arranged in advance." And that answer, simple as it was, opened a door he could not close. Jonathan shifted his stance slightly, not stepping in, not interrupting, but adjusting just enough to signal that the next part of this moment no longer required interpretation, only acknowledgement. And with that, the second official reached into his own folder, producing a document that mirrored the one Ryan had already read, placing it within view without handing it over, allowing it to exist in the space as something shared rather than contested. "Our records indicate the flight was delayed due to a flagged concern," the official said, his voice still neutral, still procedural, but the words now carried alignment, confirmation, a connection between what had been said and what had already been documented. Ryan's eyes moved to the document, then back to the official, then briefly to Jonathan, and in that sequence, the remaining certainty in his posture shifted again, narrowing further, tightening into something that no longer resembled control but resistance. "There was no concern," Ryan said more firmly this time, but the firmness lacked foundation, because denial required absence of evidence, and evidence was now present in more than one place. Emily felt it then, not as a surge of emotion, but as a quiet settling, the final confirmation that the moment she had feared, avoided, endured, had already passed, and what remained was something different entirely, something clearer. Something that did not depend on what anyone claimed but on what could be seen. A final sound broke through the air, not loud, not dramatic, just the unmistakable tone of a device syncing, uploading, confirming, and one of the officials glanced briefly at a tablet in his hand before nodding once, a small gesture, almost invisible, but decisive. "We have visual confirmation," he said, and those 4 words did not accuse, did not describe, they simply established, and in doing so, they removed the last space where uncertainty could exist. Ryan did not speak immediately this time, and that silence was different from all the others, not calculated, not strategic, but empty, as if the framework he had relied on no longer provided any response at all. Emily remained still, her hand resting where it had been from the beginning, her breathing calm, her posture steady, and as the structure around them completed itself, she understood something with absolute clarity, that truth did not need to be loud to take control of a situation. It only needed to be present, undeniable, and once it was, everything else adjusted around it whether anyone was ready or not. Ryan finally looked down, not at the documents, not at the officials, but at the ground beneath his own feet, as if for the first time he was trying to understand how everything had shifted so completely without him noticing when it happened, and in that quiet moment, the man who had once controlled every room he entered stood still with nothing left to direct, nothing left to reshape. The officials did not rush him, did not press further, because the answers they needed were no longer dependent on what he chose to say. The structure had already formed, the sequence had already aligned, and all that remained was process. "We will proceed from here," one of them said calmly, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a continuation of something already in motion, and Ryan gave a small nod, almost automatic, as if acknowledging a reality he could no longer alter. Emily watched him, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet clarity that replaced everything she had carried for months, because the man in front of her no longer held the weight he once did, not in her life, not in this moment, not in what came next. The runway felt different now, no longer tense, no longer uncertain, just still. Like a stage after the performance had ended, and the truth had been left behind for everyone to see. Jonathan stepped slightly closer to Emily, not to shield her, not to guide her, just to stand beside her, and in that simple movement there was something steady, something familiar, something that did not need to be explained. Emily took a slow breath, her hand resting gently where it had been from the beginning, and then, without hesitation, she stepped forward, past Ryan, not stopping, not looking back. Because there was nothing left behind her that belonged to her anymore. Ryan remained where he was, his posture no longer defined by confidence or control, but by stillness, the kind that comes when a man realizes that everything he built on assumption can disappear in a single moment of exposure, and no amount of power can reverse it once it is seen. The officials moved with quiet efficiency, their presence no longer disruptive but procedural, guiding what came next without urgency, without emotion. Because this was no longer a moment of confrontation, it was a sequence of consequences unfolding exactly as it should. The jet remained silent behind them, its polished surface reflecting the scene like a mirror, capturing every detail without judgment, without distortion, just as it was. Emily reached the edge of the runway and paused for a fraction of a second, not because she was unsure, but because she was aware of the distance she had crossed, aware of the weight she had set down, aware of the fact that the life ahead of her was no longer defined by someone else's control. She did not turn back, she did not need to, because closure did not come from looking at what was left behind, it came from knowing that it no longer had any power over you. Jonathan followed at a measured pace, his presence steady, unspoken, and together they moved toward what came next. Not dramatically, not triumphantly, just forward, because forward was the only direction that remained. Behind them, the runway returned to its ordinary stillness, the kind that hides nothing and remembers everything, and in that stillness, one truth settled quietly into place, clear and unshakable, that some men spend their entire lives believing they own the people beside them. Until the moment those people choose to walk away and take every ounce of that illusion with them.